It begins with a silence that spans over a century and a half, a silence held within the yellowing pages of ledgers and the hollow spaces of forgotten archives. If you were to stand on a train platform in Manhattan in the autumn of 1854, you would witness a scene that, to a modern eye, feels like a fever dream. Dozens of children, some barely old enough to speak, others with the hardened stares of those who have seen too much, were being lined up in rows. They weren't there for a school excursion or a holiday. They were part of a logistical experiment so vast it would eventually relocate 250,000 people. By the mid-19th century, New York City was a pressure cooker. The streets were teeming with what the press called the dangerous classes, an estimated 30,000 homeless children who slept in alleyways, huddled over steam vents, or sold newspapers for pennies. To the social reformers of the time, these children were a problem to be solved, a demographic tide that needed to be diverted. And so a day system was devised, a system of trains that would carry these children away from the perceived filth of the urban East to the supposed moral purity of the agrarian West. It was hailed as a miracle of modern philanthropy. But as the decades passed and the scale of the operation grew to involve 250,000 children, something began to shift. The meticulous records kept by the founding organizations started to thin. Names were changed. Families were separated with a stroke of a pen. And today, when descendants attempt to trace the lineage of those who stepped off those trains, they often hit a wall of static. Because while we know where the trains went, the final destination of the records themselves, the definitive proof of who these children were and where they actually ended up, has remained one of the greatest vanishing acts in American history. But to understand the disappearance of the records, we must first understand the man who set the wheels in motion. In 1853, a young minister named Charles Loring Brace looked at the tenements of Lower Manhattan and saw a ticking time bomb. He believed that the city was a breeding ground for pauperism, and that the only way to save the children was to drain the city of its youth. He founded the Children's Aid Society with a singular mission: to transport these children to farming families in the Midwest. In his view, the Christian home was the best institution. It was a noble sentiment, perhaps, but it was built on a foundation of radical displacement. In September 1854, the first group of 46 children was sent to Dowagiac, Michigan. The journey was grueling. They traveled in coal cars and steerage, arriving exhausted and covered in soot. When they reached their destination, they were ushered into a local church or a courthouse. They were told to stand on benches, or sometimes on actual crates, to be inspected by the local townspeople. It was a process that felt uncomfortably similar to a livestock auction, though the organizers insisted it was a selection for placement. The families who took the children were not required to legally adopt them. They were only asked to provide food, clothing, and an education in exchange for the child's labor until they reached adulthood. It was a verbal contract, a fiery handshake agreement in the middle of a crowded room. And that is where the first cracks in the historical record began to appear. In those early years, the Children's Aid Society attempted to keep track of the children through annual letters. But as the numbers swelled from hundreds to thousands, the paperwork became a nightmare. Records suggest that many of these early files were never formalized. There were surrender papers signed by desperate parents in New York who believed their children would return, But many of these documents were lost in transit or destroyed in fires. Even more troubling is the evidence of intentional obfuscation. To ensure a fresh start, children were often encouraged to forget their pasts, their surnames, and their languages. What happened next remains unclear, as the letters from the foster families began to arrive less frequently, and the Society's agents found it impossible to visit every farm. By the 1870s, the system had become a well-oiled machine. It wasn't just the Children's Aid Society anymore. The New York Foundling Hospital, run by the Sisters of Charity, had joined the effort. Their approach was slightly more structured. They sent children to Catholic families, often coordinating with local priests. They used a system of baby tags and numbered manifests. For a moment, it seemed that the chaos of the early years was being replaced by a rigorous bureaucracy. But even with the involvement of the church, the trail often went cold. Historians have noted that the placing out system relied heavily on local volunteers in the destination towns, committees of prominent citizens who were supposed to vet the new parents. But these committees were often more interested in providing cheap labor for their neighbors than in filing meticulous reports. Back to New York. The manifests showed who left the city, but they rarely confirmed who stayed in their first placement. There are stories of children who were replaced 5 or 6 times in a single year, moving from farm to farm like wandering shadows. Each move created a new layer of geographical distance and a new gap in the paperwork. In the archives of the Foundling Hospital, there are thousands of files that simply end. A child is placed in a town in Nebraska in 1884. A letter is received in 1885 saying the child is doing well, and then nothing. No death certificate, no marriage record, no further mention in the Society's books. It was as if the system was designed to dissolve the identity of the child once they crossed the Mississippi. But that wasn't the strangest part. As researchers in the 20th century began to dig into the surviving ledgers, they found something deeply unsettling. In many of the official books, entire pages had been excised with a razor blade. In others, names had been heavily redacted with thick Victorian-era ink. Why would a philanthropic organization, proud of its mission, feel the need to surgically remove the identities of its wards? Some historians believe this was done to protect the children from the stigma of their origins. Others suggest it was a way to prevent biological parents from ever finding their children, ensuring the separation was permanent. But there is no clear consensus on who authorized this erasure or exactly when it took place. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the orphan trains were no longer a small-scale experiment. They were a national phenomenon. The trains were now traversing the entire continent, reaching as far as California, Texas, and even Florida. The logistics was staggering, and yet the more expansive the network became, the more the central oversight seemed to evaporate. There is a persistent theory among certain archivists that a master ledger once existed, a comprehensive set of volumes that cross-referenced every child, every train, and every destination. For decades, it was rumored to be held in a private warehouse in New Jersey, or perhaps in the basement of a defunct Catholic orphanage in the Bronx. If it existed, it would be the Rosetta Stone of American genealogy, the only thing capable of connecting 250,000 lost souls to their origins. But as the system began to collapse under the weight of its own complexity and the rising tide of modern social work, the trail of that ledger didn't just go cold, it vanished entirely. And that's when things began to shift from a matter of lost paperwork to a haunting historical mystery. In 1904, a train pulled into the station at Clifton, Arizona, carrying 40 children from the New York Foundling Hospital. This particular journey would become a flashpoint in the history of the system, illustrating just how precarious the children's identities had become. These children, mostly of Irish descent, were scheduled to be placed with local Catholic families. However, the local families in this mining town were Mexican American. When the white residents of Clifton saw the children being handed over to these families, a literal riot ensued. In the middle of a torrential rainstorm, a mob of armed men confronted the priests and the children. They forcibly took the children from their new homes, claiming they were saving them from an unsuitable environment. What followed was a legal battle that went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But the most revealing part of the case wasn't the racial tension of the era, it was the revelation of how little the state actually knew about these children. When the court asked for the definitive records of the children's parentage to determine who had the right to claim them, the Foundling Hospital struggled to provide consistent answers. The paperwork was a patchwork of aliases and unknowns. The court eventually ruled that the children should remain with the families who had abducted them, effectively legalizing a kidnapping based on a lack of stable documentation. It was a clear signal. Once a child was on the train, their past was no longer legally binding. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. As the 20th century progressed, the system faced increasing scrutiny from a new generation of social workers who viewed the placing out method as archaic and reckless. They began to demand an accounting of the children's welfare. In response, some of the organizations began to consolidate their files. But instead of creating a centralized archive, the records became even more fragmented. Some historians believe that during this period of transition, thousands of prospects and files were destroyed. It wasn't necessarily a grand conspiracy, but rather a byproduct of institutional evolution. When an agency closed its doors or merged with another, the old records, those belonging to the children of the 1860s and 70s, were often seen as liabilities or space fillers. There are accounts of basement floods in Manhattan tenements and warehouse fires in Brooklyn that claimed unknown quantities of ledgers. In one instance, a researcher discovered that a significant portion of early 20th century placement records had been sold as scrap paper during a wartime paper drive. But as the physical evidence was disappearing, the human consequences were just beginning to surface. By the 1920s, the children of the first trains were now elderly men and women. They began to write letters to the Children's Aid Society, desperate for information about their origins. They wanted to know their real names, the names of their mothers, and the circumstances of their surrender. The responses they received were often heartbreakingly brief. A typical reply might state, "Our records for the year 1872 are incomplete," or "Your file contains no mention of your parentage." It was as if an entire generation had been told they were born from a vacuum, and that's when the trail takes a darker turn. In the late 1920s, as the Orphan Train movement was winding down, a massive administrative effort was reportedly undertaken to clean up the archives. There is no clear consensus on why this happened, but some researchers have pointed to the rise of the eugenics movement in America. There was a growing fear that the pauper blood of the city children might taint the rural population. Records suggest that some agencies may have intentionally obscured the biological backgrounds of the children to protect them and the communities they lived in from this pseudo-scientific scrutiny. If true, this would mean the disappearance of the records wasn't just an accident of history, but a deliberate act of social engineering. The final train ran in 1929. Coincidentally, the same year the stock market crashed. The Great Depression effectively killed the system. Farming families could no longer afford extra mouths to feed, and the states were beginning to implement their own foster care systems. The placing out era was over. The Children's Aid Society and the Foundling Hospital pivoted to other forms of care, and the massive logistical apparatus of the orphan trains was dismantled. But the 250,000 children didn't just disappear. They had families, they had children, and they had secrets. In the 1970s and 80s, a movement of orphan train riders began to organize. They were the last survivors, and they were determined to find the truth before it died with them. They shared stories of arriving in towns and being picked like fruit from a tree. They spoke of the black books. The agents carried small, leather-bound volumes that supposedly contained the true history of every child on the train. One survivor, who had been relocated to Missouri in 1912, recalled seeing his agent writing in one of these books during the journey. He claimed that every time a child was assigned to a family, the agent would record the family's name, the child's reaction, and a code that he believed linked back to a master file in New York. For decades, the search for these black books has been the holy grail for historians. If they still exist, they would contain the final records of the 250,000. But every time a lead appears, it seems to vanish into thin air. A private collection in a Midwest attic is rumored to have them, but the family denies it. A small-town historical society claims to have a box of manifests, but when researchers arrive, the box is missing. There is a persistent story of a massive shipment of records being moved from New York to a central repository in the 1950s. According to some accounts, the truck never reached its destination. There is no police report of an accident, no record of a theft. The documents simply failed to arrive. Whether they were discarded, lost, or intentionally diverted remains one of the most frustrating gaps in the story. What we are left with is a narrative made of shadows. We have the statistics, the 250,000, and we have the broad strokes of the policy. But the granular reality of those lives is locked behind a door for which we have no key. But that wasn't the strangest part of the archive's disappearance. In recent years, modern technology has allowed us to look at the gaps in a new way. DNA testing has begun to reconnect the descendants of the orphan train riders, bypassing the missing paperwork entirely. People are finding cousins and siblings they never knew existed, tracing their lineage back to the very tenements Charles Loring Brace sought to drain. But as these biological connections are made, they often contradict the few records that do exist. A child recorded as an orphan in an 1890 ledger might be revealed through DNA to have had a living mother and 3 siblings in New York at the time of their relocation. This suggests that the records weren't just missing or destroyed in many cases. They may have been fabricated from the very beginning. If the official records were a fiction, then the final records we are looking for might not be a ledger at all. They might be something far more complex. Evidence layers suggest that the Children's Aid Society kept a duplicate set of books for internal use, a set that contained the unvarnished truth about the children's origins, as opposed to the sanitized versions shared with foster, parents, and the public. These internal books are the ones that are said to have been relocated for safekeeping in the mid-20th century. But where they were sent and who holds the authority over them now is a question that leads into a labyrinth of private trusts and closed institutional archives. Some believe they are held by a major university under a restricted seal that won't be lifted for another 50 years. Others believe they were destroyed during the transition to digital record keeping in the 1990s. The deeper you look, the more you realize that the silence isn't just a lack of information. It's a presence. The search for the final records eventually leads to a specific cold trail in the late 1960s. At that time, a massive effort was underway to microfilm the aging paper archives of the various New York founding agencies. This was supposed to be the moment of salvation for the history of the 250,000, but reports from the time suggest a catastrophic failure of logistics. While the microfilming did occur, it was selective. Thousands of pages, deemed illegible or irrelevant by the contractors, were allegedly bypassed. What happened next remains unclear. The original paper documents the primary sources with the handwritten notes, the original signatures of the mothers, and the precise destination maps were reportedly slated for transfer to a secondary storage facility outside the city. Some researchers have tracked the manifests of these shipping containers to a series of industrial warehouses in upstate New York. But when those facilities were eventually inventoried in the early 2000s, the Orphan Train crates were nowhere to be found. It is as if the documents themselves followed the same path as the children. They were loaded onto a vehicle, sent toward a distant destination, and then simply vanished from the official narrative. This disappearance has led to a fragmented map of American history. Today, if you are a descendant of an orphan train rider, your search for the truth is a scavenger hunt across 48 states. You might find a name in a local census in Kansas, a mention in a church ledger in Missouri, or a blurred entry in a microfilmed index in New York. But the final records, the master key that would explain the logic of the system and the true identity of every child, have never been located. Some historians believe the records were never meant to survive. They argue that the system was, by its very nature, a process of erasure. To the reformers of the 19th century, the success of a child was measured by how thoroughly they assimilated into their new lives and how completely they forgot their origins. In that context, a permanent, accessible record would have been a threat to the child's new identity. The loss of the paperwork wasn't a failure of the system. It was its ultimate completion. Yet, for the millions of Americans who trace their lineage back to those 250,000 children, the silence is a physical weight. It is a story with a beginning and a middle, but a missing end. What we are left with are the echoes. We have the letters from children who thrived, writing back about their new ponies and their school grades. We also have the grim reports from agents about children who absconded into the woods or were returned as unsatisfactory. These fragments offer a glimpse into a massive, state-sanctioned upheaval that reshaped the demographic landscape of the American West. There is a final, haunting possibility that some researchers are only now beginning to voice. There are rumors of a private archive held by the Descendants of the original philanthropic families, records that were never part of the official agency files. These private papers, if they exist, might contain the missing manifests and the unredacted truth. But until those boxes are opened, if they exist at all, the destination of the final records remains the last great secret of the orphan trains. As we look back at the 1854 system, we see a mirror of our own complicated relationship with charity, authority, and the rights of the individual. We see a system that was built on the hope of a better life, but paved with the destruction of memory. The 250,000 children became the pioneers of a new world, but they did so at the cost of their own histories. The trains have long since stopped running. The tracks they traveled have often been torn up or overgrown with weeds. And the records, the names, the faces, the mothers who stood on the platforms and watched their children disappear remain lost in the static of time. Perhaps they are sitting in a mislabeled crate in a forgotten basement, waiting to be found. Or perhaps, like the children themselves, they were never intended to be found at all. For now, the story of the orphan trains remains an open wound in the American archive, a testament to the fact that while you can move a child across a continent, you can never truly outrun the silence of a missing past.